The man standing beneath Aurora Room's golden chandeliers believed humiliating a quiet woman would entertain his wealthy guests for a few harmless minutes. But before the night was over, his arrogance would cost him everything he had spent 20 years building. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Rainwater shimmered across the sidewalks of Manhattan as black SUVs lined the entrance of Aurora Room, one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York City. Men in tailored tuxedos stepped through towering glass doors while women wrapped in designer coats disappeared beneath warm amber lights and the soft sound of live piano music drifting from inside. The restaurant smelled of aged wine, cedarwood, and expensive perfume. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath ceiling lights that looked more like jewelry than decoration. Every table was booked weeks in advance. Every guest inside carried money, influence, or both. And standing at the center of that polished world was Ethan Carlisle, the restaurant's operations manager. Tall, silver-haired, and wearing a perfectly fitted black suit, Ethan moved through the dining room with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled the atmosphere itself. His smile was polished for wealthy clients, but his eyes measured people the way bankers measure risk. Then the front doors opened again. A woman stepped quietly inside, folding a rain-speckled umbrella beside the entrance. She wore a plain beige coat, low heels, and carried an old leather handbag with faded corners. Her blonde hair rested neatly over one shoulder, slightly damp from the storm outside. She didn't look poor. She simply looked invisible. Claire Whitmore paused for a moment beneath the chandelier, calmly scanning the crowded dining room as conversations echoed around her. A young couple near the bar glanced at her coat and quickly looked away. One man smirked behind a whiskey glass. Ethan noticed her immediately, not because she caused a scene, but because she didn't belong in the image he wanted his restaurant to project that night. He approached her slowly, keeping the same fake professional smile fixed across his face. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "Do you have a reservation?" Claire met his eyes calmly. "I believe there should be one under Whitmore." Ethan checked the tablet in his hand for less than 2 seconds before closing it again. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight." Claire nodded politely. "That's strange. I was told someone reserved the private dining room." Ethan's smile tightened slightly. Around them, several nearby guests had already started listening. "The private room is reserved for our VIP investors," he replied. "Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding." Claire glanced toward the glowing dining hall, where waiters carried trays of wine between marble columns. "I don't mind waiting," she said softly. Ethan let out a quiet laugh beneath his breath. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound insulting without appearing rude. "Aurora Room isn't really the kind of place people wait around hoping for cancellations." A hush settled near the entrance. One woman near the piano covered a grin behind her hand. Claire remained perfectly still. Her eyes never left Ethan's face. Then, from somewhere deeper inside the restaurant, a sharply dressed man suddenly stood from his table and looked toward the entrance with visible confusion before asking in a stunned voice, "Wait, is that Claire Whitmore?" The question echoed through the dining room like the sudden crack of glass, and for the first time that evening, Ethan Carlisle felt the carefully controlled atmosphere around him shift slightly beneath his feet. Several guests turned in their seats toward the entrance while the pianist near the marble staircase slowly stopped playing mid-note. Claire Whitmore remained calm, one hand resting lightly on the handle of her umbrella, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The man who had spoken stood near the center of the restaurant beside a long private table surrounded by investors in dark suits. He looked to be in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, sharply dressed, and visibly confused. Ethan recovered quickly, forcing another smile onto his face before stepping slightly in front of Claire. "I apologize, sir," he said smoothly. "I believe there has been some misunderstanding." But the man kept staring directly at Claire. "No," he said slowly. "I know that face." Murmurs spread across the room like ripples across still water. Claire offered the man a polite nod, but said nothing. Ethan immediately noticed the silence working against him. He could not allow uncertainty to replace control. "Ma'am," he said more firmly now. If you do not have a confirmed reservation, I am going to have to ask you to step aside from the entrance. His voice remained professional, but the irritation beneath it was becoming harder to hide. Claire finally reached into her handbag and removed her phone. The reservation should have been arranged this afternoon, she said calmly. Private dining under Whitmore. Ethan barely glanced at the screen before folding his arms. Again, our private room is occupied tonight. A few nearby guests exchanged amused looks. One younger man whispered something to his girlfriend that made her laugh quietly behind her champagne glass. Claire did not react. The rain outside continued tapping softly against the towering windows, while warm golden light reflected across the polished black floors. Ethan hated the way her silence made him feel observed instead of obeyed. Near the host's stand, a young waitress named Lily watched nervously while clutching a tray against her chest. She had worked at Aurora Room for less than 6 months, but even she could see the discomfort growing around the entrance. Claire did not sound confused or desperate. If anything, she sounded certain. Lily leaned closer toward another employee and whispered, "Maybe we should double-check the reservation list." The other server immediately shook his head. "Do not interfere," he muttered quietly. Ethan stepped closer to Claire, lowering his voice just enough to sound condescending instead of aggressive. "Look around," he said. "These guests spend thousands of dollars here in one evening. We cannot have people wandering in off the street claiming access to private investor events." The sentence landed exactly as intended. Several nearby guests smirked openly now. Someone near the bar quietly chuckled. Claire slowly lifted her eyes toward Ethan. Her expression never changed. "I am not claiming access," she replied softly. "I was invited." Ethan gave a short laugh and gestured toward the crowded dining room. "Then perhaps whoever invited you should come escort you personally." The humiliation was no longer subtle. Even the guests pretending not to watch had stopped eating. Silverware rested untouched beside crystal plates, while whispers drifted beneath the chandeliers. Lily looked increasingly uncomfortable. She noticed that Claire never once raised her voice or lost composure. That only made the situation feel worse. Then Ethan made the mistake that would later replay in his mind for years. Straightening his jacket, he looked directly at Claire and spoke loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. "If you truly belong at tonight's investor dinner," he announced with a cold smile, "then tell us exactly which company invited you." For several long seconds, nobody answered Ethan Carlisle's question. The silence itself became humiliating. Claire Whitmore stood beneath the warm chandelier light, while dozens of wealthy strangers watched her as though she were suddenly part of the evening's entertainment. Outside, rain streaked down the tall windows overlooking Manhattan, turning the city lights into blurred rivers of gold and white. Ethan kept his cold smile perfectly in place, but inside, he could already feel the room leaning toward his side. Public opinion in places like Aurora Room shifted quickly. All it took was confidence. Claire slowly placed her phone back inside her handbag. "The invitation came from the Hale Investment Group," she answered calmly. A few people exchanged glances. Someone near the bar quietly whispered, "Hale." Then another guest laughed under his breath. "Everyone in New York claims they know Victor Hale." Ethan let out a soft chuckle, careful to make it sound polite. "Of course," he said smoothly. "And I suppose you are personally connected to Mr. Hale as well." Claire met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." That single word caused several nearby guests to smirk openly now. A woman in a diamond necklace leaned toward her husband and muttered loudly enough to be heard, "This is becoming painful." Another man lifted his phone slightly, pretending to check messages while clearly recording the scene. The pressure around Claire thickened by the second, but her expression never changed. She stood calmly beneath the lights, as if humiliation simply refused to touch her. Ethan hated that composure. It made him feel challenged. "Ma'am," he said, his voice sharper now, "Victor Hale is hosting some of the most powerful investors in the country tonight. People flew in from California and Texas for this dinner. Do you honestly expect anyone here to believe you were invited to join them?" Claire answered quietly, "I do not expect anything from anyone here." The sentence unsettled him more than anger would have. Near the host's stand, Lily continued watching nervously. Something about Claire's voice felt wrong for a fraud. There was no desperation in it. No panic. No performance. Then Lily noticed something else. As Claire adjusted her handbag slightly against her arm, A silver card holder briefly slipped into view beneath the restaurant lights. Embossed across the corner was a small symbol Lily recognized immediately. A white phoenix surrounded by a circle. Lily had seen that logo earlier that week printed across confidential investor folders delivered to the private dining room upstairs. Her eyes widened slightly. Before she could say anything, another employee nudged her shoulder sharply, silently warning her not to interfere. Ethan took another step closer to Claire. "Let me save you further embarrassment," he said. "Whatever misunderstanding brought you here tonight, this event is private." Claire glanced calmly toward the staircase leading upstairs where soft music echoed from behind closed doors. "Then perhaps someone upstairs should decide whether I belong here." Several guests reacted immediately with amused disbelief. A man near the wine display laughed openly this time. "She really thinks she is expected upstairs." The woman beside him shook her head. "This is exactly why exclusive places lose their standards." Ethan noticed the crowd turning fully against Claire now, and his confidence returned stronger than before. Nothing fed arrogance faster than public approval. He straightened his cuffs and smiled toward the surrounding guests, as though reassuring them that order would soon be restored. Then he looked back at Claire with calculated politeness. "Very well," he announced loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear. "If you insist on claiming access to a private investor dinner, then I believe everyone deserves clarity." He turned toward the front desk and snapped his fingers lightly at a young employee. "Bring the guest list downstairs," he said coldly. "Let us settle this publicly." The young employee hurried back toward the entrance carrying a leather reservation folder against his chest, while conversations throughout Aurora Room slowed into tense curiosity. Guests leaned subtly in their seats, pretending not to stare while openly waiting for the outcome. The soft piano music had faded completely now, replaced only by the quiet clinking of silverware and the muffled sound of rain outside. Ethan Carlyle accepted the folder with the confidence of a man certain he was about to win publicly. He opened it carefully beneath the chandelier light, slowly scanning each page while Claire Whitmore stood only a few feet away in complete silence. Her calmness had become almost unsettling. Most people in her position would have argued by now. They would have become embarrassed, defensive, emotional. But Claire simply waited, her umbrella resting beside her leg, her posture steady and dignified despite dozens of judgmental eyes fixed on her. Ethan flipped another page, then another. His expression relaxed further with every passing second. Finally, he closed the folder and looked up with visible satisfaction. "As expected," he announced loudly, "there is no reservation under Whitmore." Several nearby guests nodded immediately, relieved that their assumptions had been confirmed. One man near the bar smirked openly and whispered, "I knew it." The woman beside him laughed softly into her wine glass. Ethan handed the folder back to the employee and adjusted his cufflinks with practiced elegance. "Aurora Room takes privacy very seriously," he continued. "We cannot allow unverified individuals to wander into exclusive investor events simply because they claim to know important people." The sentence landed like a public verdict. Claire absorbed the humiliation without moving. Lily felt her stomach tighten behind the host's stand. She kept remembering the silver phoenix symbol on Claire's card holder, the same symbol printed on the confidential investor materials upstairs. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong, but fear kept her frozen. Ethan stepped aside slightly and gestured toward the front doors. "I am going to ask you to leave now." A hush swept across the room. Even the guests enjoying the spectacle grew quiet for a moment. Claire looked toward the rain-covered windows, then back at Ethan. The chandelier light reflected softly in her calm blue eyes. "You believe I do not belong here," she said quietly. Ethan folded his hands in front of him. "I believe this restaurant maintains standards." Claire nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. "Interesting," she replied. "Because places usually reveal their true standards by how they treat people with no visible status." The room went still. For the first time all evening, Ethan's smile weakened slightly. The sentence was not loud. It was not angry, but it carried the kind of quiet truth that made people uncomfortable. Several guests looked down at their glasses. One older investor near the staircase slowly removed his reading glasses and studied Claire more carefully now. Ethan forced a small laugh, eager to regain control of the room before doubt spread again. "Very poetic," he said coldly. "But this is still private property." Claire gave a gentle nod. Of course. Then, without another word, she reached down and picked up her umbrella. The movement felt strangely heavy, as though the entire restaurant suddenly realized they had all participated in something ugly. Lily watched Claire carefully slip her phone back into her handbag. As the bag shifted beneath the lights, the silver phoenix symbol appeared again for only a second. This time, the older investor near the staircase noticed it too. His expression changed instantly. Claire turned calmly toward the entrance while rainwater shimmered against the glass doors ahead of her. Behind her, Ethan straightened proudly, believing the situation was finally over. But just as Claire reached for the door handle, a deep voice suddenly echoed from the upper staircase. "Why?" the voice asked sharply. "Is Claire Whitmore leaving my dinner?" The voice from the staircase cut through the restaurant so sharply that even the rain outside seemed to disappear for a moment. Every head turned upward at once. A tall man with silver hair and a navy overcoat stood near the top landing beneath the soft golden lights of the private floor. Victor Hale rarely entered a room unnoticed, but tonight his presence carried something heavier than authority. It carried confusion. Ethan Carlyle's confident posture stiffened immediately. "Mr. Hale," he said quickly, forcing another polished smile onto his face. "We were simply handling a misunderstanding." Victor's eyes never left Claire Whitmore. "A misunderstanding," he repeated slowly. Claire remained beside the glass entrance doors, one hand resting lightly on her umbrella. She looked almost untouched by the humiliation surrounding her. Victor descended several steps, his expression tightening with every second. "Claire," he said, his tone softer now, "I have been waiting upstairs for nearly 40 minutes. The entire dining room fell silent again. A wine glass stopped halfway to someone's lips. Near the piano, a couple slowly exchanged stunned looks. Ethan's face lost color so gradually it almost seemed unreal beneath the chandelier lights. Claire offered Victor a small, calm smile. "There was some confusion at the entrance," she replied gently. Victor glanced toward Ethan, then toward the crowd surrounding the host's stand. He immediately understood more than anyone needed to explain. The silence became unbearable. Lily lowered her eyes, ashamed of herself for not speaking sooner. Ethan opened his mouth quickly. "Mr. Hale, if I had known," Victor interrupted him with a single look. "That is precisely the problem," he said coldly. The words landed like ice across the marble floors. No one moved. No one even touched their silverware anymore. Claire slowly looked around the restaurant, taking in the expensive suits, the crystal chandeliers, the polished walls glowing amber beneath soft designer lighting. For a brief moment, something distant moved through her expression. Not anger, not triumph. Memory. Victor noticed it immediately. His voice softened again. "Tonight mattered to you," he said quietly. Claire nodded once. "My father used to wash dishes in restaurants like this," she said. "When I was 12 years old, he told me something I never forgot." The room remained completely still. Even Ethan said nothing now. Claire's eyes drifted toward the rain sliding down the windows. "He said the true measure of elegance is not how a place treats important people. It is how they treat the person nobody notices." Several guests lowered their eyes. The shame spreading through the room no longer belonged only to Ethan. Claire continued calmly, her voice never rising above conversation level. Tonight would have been his birthday. The sentence changed everything. The cruelty of the evening suddenly felt heavier beneath the golden lights. Lily felt tears sting her eyes unexpectedly. She looked toward Claire with growing admiration instead of pity. Claire noticed the young waitress watching her and gave her a small, reassuring smile, as though comforting her instead. "Do not blame yourself," Claire said softly. "Kind people often stay quiet because they are afraid of losing something." Lily swallowed hard, unable to answer. Victor descended the final steps slowly until he stood directly beside Claire near the entrance doors. Around them, the atmosphere of Aurora Room had completely transformed. The same guests who laughed earlier now looked deeply uncomfortable sitting beneath the chandeliers. Ethan stood frozen near the host's stand, his carefully constructed confidence collapsing silently piece by piece. Then, from outside the restaurant, the low sound of engines rolled through the rain. Headlights swept across the windows in long beams of white light. One black luxury sedan after another began pulling up beside the curb. Several chauffeurs stepped out simultaneously beneath the stormy Manhattan night. And as the restaurant staff turned toward the entrance in confusion, Victor Hale quietly said words that made Ethan's stomach drop instantly. The board members are here. The line of black sedans outside Aurora Rooms stretched along the rain-soaked curb like a silent procession of power. Drivers stepped out in dark coats while Manhattan traffic slowed beneath flashing reflections of red brake lights and wet pavement. Inside the restaurant, conversations had completely disappeared. Every guest stood frozen beneath the chandeliers as the first members of the Hale Investment Group entered through the glass doors one after another. These were not celebrities chasing attention or wealthy tourists showing off expensive watches. These were the people whose signatures moved billions of dollars across industries. Older men with calm expressions, women carrying leather portfolios instead of jewelry, faces that appeared quietly on magazine covers beside headlines about acquisitions, mergers, and global investments. The atmosphere inside Aurora Room shifted instantly from luxury to tension. Ethan Carlisle felt it immediately. One board member entered and paused the moment he saw Claire Whitmore standing near the entrance. Another removed his gloves slowly, clearly confused by the scene unfolding before him. Then a tall woman with silver-framed glasses stepped forward from the group and stared directly at Claire. "You started without her?" she asked Victor Hale in disbelief. A murmur spread across the room. Ethan's stomach tightened painfully. Victor looked toward the board members with visible frustration. "Apparently," he said coldly, Claire was denied entry to her own meeting. The words struck the restaurant harder than thunder. Several guests physically turned in their chairs. One man nearly dropped his wine glass. Near the piano, the influencer who had secretly recorded Claire earlier hurriedly lowered his phone and slipped it into his pocket. Ethan blinked once, unable to process what he had just heard. His face slowly drained of color beneath the golden lights. "Her meeting," he repeated weakly. No one answered him immediately. They did not need to. Claire stood quietly near the entrance while the most powerful people in the building instinctively moved toward her instead of away from her. The shift in body language alone told the entire story. Lily covered her mouth softly in shock. Suddenly, every strange detail from earlier made sense. The calmness, the confidence, the silver phoenix symbol. Ethan looked at Claire again, but this time he no longer saw an ordinary woman in a simple beige coat. He saw a disaster he had created with his own arrogance. Victor Hale stepped beside Claire respectfully. "Everyone has been waiting upstairs," he said. "The acquisition documents are ready." Several guests nearby exchanged stunned whispers. Acquisition. The word spread rapidly through the dining room. Ethan felt his pulse begin hammering in his throat. Aurora Room was part of the Aurora Hospitality Group, a struggling luxury chain rumored for months to be negotiating with outside investors. But nobody knew who the buyer was. Until now. Claire glanced calmly toward the staircase leading upstairs. "I did not intend to make a scene tonight," she said quietly. "I only wanted one peaceful dinner before the meeting." Her voice remained soft, but somehow that only made the shame inside the restaurant heavier. One elderly investor near the fireplace shook his head slowly while looking at Ethan. "You judged her before she even spoke," he muttered. Ethan immediately stepped forward. "Ms. Whitmore, I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding." But the apology sounded hollow now, rushed and desperate beneath the silence surrounding him. Claire studied him for a long moment. Not with anger. That would have been easier for him to survive. She looked at him with disappointment. Calm. Controlled. Final. Rain continued sliding down the tall glass windows behind her while the chandeliers reflected softly against the marble floors. The same room that laughed at her less than 15 minutes earlier now looked unable to breathe. Claire finally spoke, her voice almost gentle. "The dangerous thing about arrogance," she said quietly, "is that it usually reveals itself before intelligence does." The silence inside Aurora Room no longer felt elegant. It felt exposed. Rain continued sliding across the towering windows while the board members of Hale Investment Group slowly gathered near the entrance beside Claire Whitmore. The balance of power inside the restaurant had shifted so completely that even the air seemed heavier beneath the chandeliers. Ethan Carlisle stood motionless near the host's stand, his face pale beneath the warm lighting as whispers quietly spread across the dining room. Guests who had laughed at Claire only minutes earlier now avoided looking directly at her. Victor Hale turned toward the investors surrounding him. "For those of you who have not met her personally," he said calmly, "Claire Whitmore is the founder and majority owner of Whitmore Capital." Several people near the back of the restaurant inhaled sharply. The name alone carried enormous weight in financial circles. Whitmore Capital had quietly rebuilt struggling businesses across the country for years without turning itself into a media spectacle. Claire rarely appeared in interviews. She avoided magazine covers, investor conferences, and celebrity charity events. Most people knew her company. Very few recognized her face. 3 months ago, Victor continued, Whitmore Capital became the lead buyer negotiating the acquisition of Aurora Hospitality Group. Ethan lowered his eyes slowly. The truth now stood fully exposed in front of the entire restaurant. Claire was not simply attending the meeting upstairs. She was the reason the meeting existed at all. Lily felt chills run down her arms as she watched the guests around her process the revelation. The same woman they dismissed as unimportant was the person holding the future of the entire restaurant chain in her hands. One older board member stepped closer to Claire with visible respect. "The employee scholarship program was your idea too, was it not?" he asked. Claire nodded quietly. "Hospitality workers deserve pathways upward," she replied. "Most people ignore the ones carrying trays until they need something from them." Lily stared at Claire in disbelief. Earlier that year, Aurora Hospitality Group had quietly launched a nationwide program paying college tuition for restaurant employees and kitchen staff. The company never publicly announced who funded it. Lily herself had received one of those scholarships 2 months earlier. Her eyes filled immediately as she realized who had made it possible. "That was you," she whispered softly. Claire looked toward her and smiled gently. "Education changes lives faster than money does." The young waitress suddenly felt ashamed for staying silent earlier. "I should have said something," Lily admitted quietly. "I knew something was wrong." Claire shook her head calmly. "You were trying to protect your job," she said. "Fear makes good people hesitate sometimes. That does not make them bad." The kindness in her voice only deepened the shame spreading through the room. Several employees standing near the entrance lowered their heads. Even some guests now looked uncomfortable sitting beside half-finished glasses of wine and untouched plates worth hundreds of dollars. Ethan finally stepped forward again, his confidence completely gone. "Ms. Whitmore," he said carefully, "there is no excuse for what happened tonight." Claire turned toward him slowly. The room seemed to hold its breath again. "No," she replied softly. "There is not." Ethan swallowed hard. "Please allow me to make this right." For a long moment, Claire simply studied him beneath the golden lights. She could have humiliated him publicly now. Everyone in the restaurant expected it. Some probably wanted it. But when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm. "Humiliation does not teach dignity," she said quietly. "It only changes who suffers from the lack of it." The sentence settled across the restaurant like a final judgment. The guests no longer looked at Claire Whitmore with amusement or suspicion. They looked at her with something far rarer: respect. The atmosphere inside Aurora Room had transformed completely by the time Claire Whitmore finally walked toward the staircase beside Victor Hale. Nobody laughed anymore. The same guests who once dismissed her now stepped aside quietly to clear a path for her through the marble dining room. Some lowered their eyes out of embarrassment. Others watched her with open admiration, struggling to reconcile the calm woman in the beige coat with the powerful investor they had all failed to recognize. Claire paused halfway to the staircase and turned back toward the employees gathered near the host's stand. Her gaze settled briefly on Lily. "What is your full name?" she asked gently. The young waitress looked startled. "Lily Carter," she answered nervously. Claire nodded once. "Victor, please make sure Ms. Carter's scholarship is renewed through graduate school." Lily's eyes widened instantly. "Ms. Whitmore, you do not have to do that." Claire smiled softly. People who notice injustice should never be punished for lacking power. The sentence spread quietly through the room. Several employees exchanged emotional looks, while Victor immediately nodded in agreement. "Consider it done," he said. Claire then turned toward the restaurant staff, standing frozen beside Ethan Carlisle. "I also want every Aurora Hospitality location to begin mandatory hospitality ethics training starting next quarter," she continued calmly. "Not customer service training. Human dignity training." Ethan lowered his head slightly. Every word felt heavier than anger would have. Claire was not destroying anyone. She was rebuilding the very system that failed her only minutes earlier. That made the lesson impossible to escape. One board member adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. That policy alone may redefine the company culture nationwide, he admitted quietly. Claire answered without pride. Luxury should never require humiliation to exist. Near the dining room entrance, the same older investor who had watched silently earlier slowly stood from his table and approached Claire with visible respect. "I owe you an apology," he said sincerely. "I judge the room by appearances too." Claire shook his hand politely. "Most people do," she replied. "That is why kindness matters before certainty does." Around them, guests who had once whispered mockingly now listened carefully to every word she spoke. The entire emotional gravity of the evening had reversed. Ethan remained near the host's stand, unable to escape the consequences of his own behavior. He had spent years mastering the appearance of elegance while forgetting its purpose entirely. For the first time in a very long time, he looked unsure of himself. Victor finally turned toward him. "The board will review tonight's incident formally," he said in a measured tone. "Your position will be evaluated after the acquisition closes." Ethan nodded silently. He did not argue. He understood that the true punishment had already arrived long before any official decision. Every employee in the restaurant had witnessed what happened. Every guest would remember it. And worst of all, he himself would remember the exact moment he chose arrogance over humanity. Claire noticed the devastation quietly settling across his face. "Mr. Carlyle," she said calmly. Ethan slowly looked up at her. The room became silent again. "I am not interested in ruining your life," Claire continued softly. "But I hope tonight changes the way you look at people who cannot benefit you." Ethan swallowed hard. The words struck deeper than humiliation because they carried no cruelty inside them, only truth. He glanced around the dining room one last time. The marble floors, the chandeliers, the wealthy guests. Earlier that evening, he believed power belonged to whoever controlled the room. But now he understood something far more painful. Real power belonged to the person who never needed to prove they had it in the first place. Nearly 2 hours later, the storm outside Manhattan had softened into a quiet drizzle by the time the final signatures were placed on the acquisition documents upstairs. The atmosphere inside Aurora Room no longer carried the cold tension of earlier that evening. Instead, a strange calm had settled across the restaurant, as though everyone inside understood they had witnessed something far more important than a business deal. The investors slowly departed one by one, shaking Claire Whitmore's hand with genuine respect before disappearing into the rainy New York night. Downstairs, several employees remained near the dining room entrance long after their shifts should have ended. Nobody wanted to leave yet. Lily stood near the host's stand, clutching a small folder against her chest, still overwhelmed after Victor Hale personally informed her that her scholarship had been fully expanded through law school if she chose to continue her education. "I do not even know how to thank you," she admitted softly as Claire descended the staircase beside Victor. Claire smiled warmly. "One day, help someone else who feels invisible." Lily nodded immediately, tears shining in her eyes. "I will." Nearby, guests who had once whispered insults now quietly stepped aside whenever Claire walked past them. Some offered apologies with lowered voices and embarrassed expressions. Claire accepted each one with simple grace, never humiliating anyone in return. That alone left the strongest impression of all. Ethan Carlyle remained near the dining room entrance, staring silently at the polished marble floor beneath the chandeliers he once controlled so confidently. He no longer looked like the untouchable manager who judged people from the doorway. He simply looked tired, human. When Claire finally approached him, the room instinctively fell quiet again. Ethan lifted his eyes slowly. "Ms. Whitmore," he said carefully, "I spent years believing luxury meant protecting certain standards." He paused briefly, ashamed of his own words now. "Tonight, I realized I forgot the most important one." Claire listened without interrupting. Ethan swallowed hard before continuing. "I am truly sorry for how I treated you. Not because of who you are, because no person deserved that." This time the apology sounded real. There was no performance left inside it. Claire studied him for a long moment beneath the soft golden light. Then she gave a small nod. "People reveal themselves most honestly when they believe someone has nothing to offer them," she replied quietly. Ethan lowered his eyes again, understanding the truth inside those words more painfully than ever. Victor stepped forward beside Claire. The board has decided you will remain with Aurora Hospitality during the transition period, he informed Ethan. Surprise crossed Ethan's face instantly. I do not understand, he admitted. Victor glanced toward Claire. Because she believes people can learn. Ethan looked at Claire speechlessly. Of all the outcomes he feared tonight, mercy had never been one of them. Claire picked up her umbrella from beside the entrance doors and prepared to leave at last. Before stepping outside, she paused briefly near the host's stand where an old black and white photograph hung quietly on the wall. It showed restaurant kitchen workers from nearly 30 years earlier standing shoulder to shoulder behind steaming pots and metal counters. Claire's eyes softened immediately. One of the men in the picture was her father, younger, tired, smiling proudly in a white apron. For several seconds, she simply stood there in silence. Then she lightly touched the corner of the frame before turning toward the rain-covered streets outside. The doors opened softly. Cool night air drifted into the restaurant while the city lights shimmered across the wet pavement beyond. Nobody spoke as Claire Whitmore disappeared into the quiet Manhattan night beneath her umbrella. And that night, everyone inside Aurora Room remembered that dignity does not announce itself through wealth or status. It simply waits for someone humble enough to recognize it.